I rise in support of the legislation that's pending and the substitute that will be offered by the chair of the committee, Senator Boxer, to the Lieberman-Warner Climate Security Act, which is obviously a historic measure that's a benchmark for America in confronting the pressing and pervasive threat of global climate change. Mr. President, this is not a Democrat issue, it's not a Republican issue, it's not a conservative or liberal issue. This is a human issue. It's a planetary issue. It's a moral issue. It's a matter and question of stewardship, of responsibility, not only to ourselves and the world in which we live, but most critically to a future we will never inhabit, what will largely determine based on decisions we make now. In that light, I want to express my profound gratitude to the chair of the committee, Senator Boxer, without whom obviously this simply would not have been possible. I want to thank her for her long-standing advocacy and championship, bridging the partisan divide, which I think is what this legislation that's pending before the United States Senate, the substitute that will be offered by her tomorrow, because I think it is critical that we begin this process in developing the U.S.'s leadership with respect to one of the most pressing and transformational issues not only facing this country, but the world community. I also want to express my profound gratitude to Senator Lieberman and to Senator Warner for their outstanding and long-time leadership as well in advocacy and developing those solutions to stem global climate change. It's certainly one of the most consequential issues of this century, and I want to thank them for their vision and courage, and Senator Boxer for doing all that they could to bring this legislation to this point in the United States Senate to really have first ever debate on a monumental issue that will reverberate for generations. And I know I've heard much here in the debate, and hopefully I'll be able to offer some of the counterpoints later on in this debate. I want to lay out my own views with respect to this issue because I think it is so critical for the future of this country. And I don't think we can afford the option of inaction, Mr. President, any longer. And I think this is the time in which we have to engage in global leadership and to lead the way on this critical issue and not to forfeit what is essential for the United States to position itself on one of the major environmental issues of all time. And I want to thank the Senator from Virginia, for whom this leadership has been the hallmark of his 29 years of service in the United States Senate. And that ennobling quality is now on display yet again today in this vital and timely issue before this body. We have arrived at this day as this issue of global warming should no longer be an option to serious skepticism. Just this past week, the United States government released a report that concluded that climate change is affecting the nation's ecosystems, causing significant changes such as increasing incidences of severe storms in some areas, water scarcities from the lack of rain and snowpack in others, along with insect outbreaks and forest fires. Looking to the future, in the words of the U.S. Department of Agriculture report, even under the most optimistic carbon dioxide emission scenarios, important changes in sea level, regional, and super-regional temperatures and precipitation patterns will have profound effects, end quote. The bottom line is that this debate is no longer a question of science. It's now a question of our political will to provide solutions to these problems. And I believe that the substitute bill that we will be debating later on this week, with an approach that mirrors closely what Senator Kerry and I called for in the Global Warming Reduction Act that we introduced in the last two Congresses, offers a measure that anyone who has analyzed the science and is honestly committed to addressing global warming can support. It establishes a federal program to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions as much as 66% by 2050 through a mandatory cap-and-trade program that provides companies with both the flexibility and certainty necessary for their continued viability and growth while allowing the United States to lead the world in reducing damaging CO2 emissions for the generations to follow. And it presents us with a watershed opportunity that our obligation to the future dictates we must seize now. Mr. President, I have not come lightly or lately to this debate. Having co-sponsored the Lieberman and McCain Climate Stewardship Act in the 108th and 109th Congresses, as well as the Global Warming Prevention Act, as far back as 1988, when I was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. So I'm left to wonder exactly how far down the road we would be now if we had acted then. That was 20 years ago, when one of the first climate change legislations was introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate. And here we are in 2008, and yet we have not engaged in this issue in a proactive way as a nation. Indeed, it's been my concern regarding global climate change that led me to accept an invitation in 2004 to be the co-chair of the International Climate Change Task Force established by 3 respected think tanks: the Institute for Public Policy Research in the United Kingdom, the Center for American Progress in the United States, and the Australian Institute. And in working with my co-chair, the Right Honorable Stephen Byers of the United Kingdom, our goal was to develop recommendations to blaze a trail for engaging all countries to forge an international consensus for action on climate change, including the United States, China, and India, which are not bound by the Kyoto Protocol, as we all know. Subsequently, our task force published a series of recommendations in January 2005, meeting the climate challenge. And right at the top of our list, based on scientific consensus, was the necessity of preventing global temperatures from rising more than 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 2 degrees Celsius over the course of this century. Beyond that 2 degrees Celsius increase, the planet would arrive at a tipping point, a potential abrupt climate change that would have catastrophic effects on our ecosystems and our society. Already we have witnessed the early warning signals, with the loss of Arctic sea ice, for instance, that appears to be accelerating faster than scientific models only recently predicted. So what it will require to ensure we remain below the 2 degrees Celsius tipping point? Well, currently there exists a concentration of 380 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the world's atmosphere. An increase of 2 degrees Celsius correlates with the carbon dioxide concentration at 450 parts per million. Therefore, ensuring we do not exceed this concentration level is absolutely essential. An additional recommendation in our report called for the G8 and other major economies, including from the developing world, to form a G8 plus climate group to involve major CO2 emitting countries in the climate change debate to ultimately develop a blueprint for moving forward in the carbon dioxide reduction program. As a result, a G8 plus 5 ministerial level group was established with the 5 major developing countries of China, India, Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa. President Bush has expanded upon this idea as a basis for his current major economy meetings, and the current G8 president, the Japanese Prime Minister, is employing the same guidance at this summer's G8 summit. The point is, Mr. President, that we have established that we cannot risk an increase of more than 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures. We further know that CO2 emissions contribute to global warming. And there is no doubt this is an international problem requiring an international solution that must include action on behalf of the world's highest CO2 emitters if the effort is to be effective. Indeed, our task force specifically recommended that all developed countries introduce national mandatory cap-and-trade systems for carbon emissions and construct these systems so that they may be integrated into a single global market. And that, of course, is the linchpin of the bill that's before us, a mandatory domestic cap-and-trade system for the United States that would achieve an actual 71% emissions reduction by 2050 for the 87% of the nation's emitters that are capped under the bill, with a 66% reduction of total U.S. emissions by 2050. Now, I fully understand, Mr. President, that this bill represents a major new initiative for the United States. And therefore, I want to underscore that this is not, as some have asserted, a proposed solution to a problem that does not actually exist. We are not being compelled by guesswork or by unsubstantiated theory or by popular perception. We are being led by the facts. This past year, the scientists on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who shared in the 2008 Nobel Peace Prize, recently completed the IPCC's 4th assessment report, which was 6 years in the making and drew on the work of more than 2,500 scientists, 800 contributing authors and 450 lead authors. And as a ranking member of the Commerce Subcommittee in Oceans, Atmospheres, Fisheries, and Coast Guard, which oversees NOAA, I would like to congratulate the 120 NOAA scientists, I add, who are part of the working group, the physical science basis of the International Panel on Climate Change, who shared in the Nobel Peace Prize. And you can see all of their names listed on this poster that I have right here. 120 of our own scientists who reached the same conclusions. And I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that the names of these exceptional federal scientists be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
The IPCC's key findings were agreed to unanimously by more than 130 governments, including those of the United States, China, India, and the European Union, and now forming the basis for international policy. And for the first time since its first assessment in 1990, and I repeat, 1990, the IPCC concluded there is at least a 90% chance that man-made activities through the burning of fossil fuels are the major cause of global warming. Now, if we were told in any sphere that we had at least a 90% chance of averting a disaster through changes we ourselves could make, would we not take action? Is the IPCC finding not a compelling reason to assume reasonable steps when climate change is occurring even beyond the projections that were outlined just decades ago? So here in these charts, Mr. President, we have some illustrations of just what the science is referring to. Arctic sea ice from NASA's images taken in 1979, 2005, and again in 2007, displaying the increase in the melting of the polar ice in September, when the sea ice is usually at its minimum each year. And so you can see the differences between the 1979 with the sea ice, Mr. President, when you see the masses of the sea ice, and then of course you look progressively and see what's happened in 2005 and 2007, and you see the demonstrative difference and discrepancies in what is happening with the melting process just since 1979. When you look at the amount of sea ice noted in September, it looked like, you know, this massive amount in 1979, and here we are progressively to 2007. Obviously, we have a serious problem that the global community needs to recognize and we need to address, and that's why we cannot forfeit our leadership in this process. And it's quite obvious that more of the sea ice has melted than ever before, and when you look at the 2007 picture, it obviously indicates how alarmingly the sea ice has diminished, even opening up the Northwest Passage, Mr. President. This is some of what the U.S. Department of the Interior looked at when listing the polar bear as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, as its habitat is literally melting away. The May 29th U.S. Climate Change Science Program, called the Scientific Assessment of the Effects of Global Change in the United States, stated that the 2007 Arctic sea ices were 23% below the previous all-time minimum observed in 2005. And I repeat that, Mr. President, because that is significant. By our own report that was issued just last week, saying that Arctic sea ices were 23% below the previous all-time minimum observed in 2005. In just 2 years, we see a decline of more than 23%. Some models suggest that the Arctic Ocean is likely to be free of summer ice as soon as 2040. Closer to home, the report stated that the energy sector will be subject to the effects of climate change through direct impacts from increased intensity of extreme weather events. Increasingly, global temperatures, rising sea levels, and changing weather patterns will pose significant challenges to the nation's roads, airports, railways, transit systems, and ports. What we are talking about is our energy and transportation network that is vital not only to the entire U.S. economy, but to our quality of life. And the new facts just keep on coming. Just last month, a study was published in the journal Science, and it's called Expanding Oxygen Minimum Zones in the Tropical Ocean, warning that marine zones where fish and other sea life can suffocate from lacks of oxygen are spreading across the world's tropical oceans. Scientists warn that if global temperatures keep rising, there could be dramatic consequences for marine life and for humans in communities that depend on the sea for a living. So let us move beyond the question of should we act, as many of our own states have chosen to do. Maine, California, Hawaii, Minnesota, New Jersey, Oregon, and Washington have all had mandatory climate laws on the books that mandate limits on greenhouse gas emissions. At least 23 states have joined one of the 3 regional partnerships that will require greenhouse gas or just carbon dioxide emission reductions. Set to take effect in 2009, the Northeast Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or known as RGGI, is a partnership of 10 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, including my own state of Maine, that creates a cap-and-trade system to limit carbon dioxide emissions from power plants. And yet, while the states have moved out on the vanguard, Mr. President, as their citizens have demanded, Congress has dallied, hiding behind the red herring of arguments of scientific uncertainty, rather than considering the truth that peer-reviewed science has revealed. Mr. President, the legislation before us has been crafted to respect the courageous initiatives of these states while recognizing that a patchwork of state-to-state regulations is a serious impediment for U.S. businesses and industry. It does not preempt existing state policies or state authority to limit or to avoid greenhouse gas emissions, but rather authorizes transition funds to assist the Northeast Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative partners, for instance, in meshing with the new federal program if they so choose. And we have worked to make additional improvements to the bill that was passed out of the Senate Environment Committee to garner the breadth of support necessary to get this bill passed. But I think it's illustrative of the states' leaderships that 23 states have already been willing to take action, to be progressive, to understand the dimensions of this problem, that they're willing to accept, the challenges and also the cost of being able to move forward independently and separately because the federal government has failed to take action, that the United States Congress has failed to take action, Mr. President, for so long, that 23 states across this country have been prepared to do it. So this legislation recognizes that. That's why it's important to give the certainty, of a federal standard so that businesses can operate knowing that what regulations will be in play. In fact, businesses have joined together with environmental organizations to reach an agreement, understanding that it works in the national interest to work in concert and to understand as they prepare to make the investments for 40 and 50 years beyond. And that's the point of having a national standard. And the fact that the states have been prepared to assume that leadership, irrespective of the failure of the Congress to address it, I think illustrates their willingness and their courage to move forward on this critical issue. For those who have expressed concerns about the impact to the federal budget, well, this new substitute is now deficit neutral, according to a June 2nd CBO report, and I would like unanimous consent to submit this CBO report in the record, Mr. President.
Without objection.
At the same time, the bill also allows us to respond to the complex issues of curbing greenhouse gas emissions while squarely confronting the argument that reaching carbon dioxide emissions will damage our economy. To the contrary, funds generated for the federal government from this auction of carbon emission allowances that are established under this legislation can be held, purchased, or sold in the program's first 18 years so they can generate $1 trillion for clean technology and worker training and retraining programs. Moreover, the bill provides funding to help industry meet the new emissions targets, not just in the short term, but all the way through 2050. So it has a long-term view and also accepts the long-term responsibilities and obligations that accompany this legislation. It also encourages low and zero carbon technologies that will change as the technologies are developed and come online by placing a cost on greenhouse gas emissions, but it also offers the private sector the certainty they require with respect to the laws they must comply with well into the future before they invest in low and zero carbon technologies. And that's important so that businesses not only understand the standards that will be established for the next 40 to 50 years, it also is logical for them in terms of making their decisions, their financial investments, understanding what the long term will prescribe. In addition, this bill provides a range of funding incentives for manufacturers of high-efficiency consumer products, manufacturers of zero, low-carbon generation technology, advanced coal technology, fuel from cellulosic biofuels, electric vehicles, hybrid, plug-in electric cars, fuel cell-powered cars, and advanced diesel, all areas of potential future economic growth that should put America well on its way for developing the alternative technologies that are so essential to making us independent of fossil fuels. The substitute legislation to the Climate Security Act also adds $800 billion through 2050 for a tax relief package to help consumers with energy costs that will be developed by the Senate Finance Committee. It also will provide $250 billion in funding through 2050 from auction revenues for states to assist them in protecting against possible future effects of climate change, such as storm surges and rising sea levels in coastal states. In addition, $566 billion will be provided through 2050 for states that take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that the funding can be used for specific state purposes such as the LIHEAP program and energy efficiency programs as well. I'm also pleased that the Climate Security Act has included language from a bill that Senator Klobuchar and I introduced to establish a robust tracking system to inventory greenhouse gas emissions from significant sources across this country. This was a critical first step that the European Union did not have in place when instituting their emissions trading system, and as a result of this lack of accurate data, they gave away too many allowances to industry that could be traded, and the carbon market bottomed out. The substitute further includes strong market oversight provisions from legislation that Senator Feinstein and I introduced to ensure price transparency and prevent market manipulation and other abusive practices when carbon emission allowances are sold in the carbon market created by this legislation. Mr. President, this bill is not perfect, but in fact it does go hand in glove with robust economic growth. The science of the matter tells us that business as usual certainly is not an option. Adhering to the status quo will continue current U.S. job losses to other countries that must be brought under the same umbrella for greenhouse gas reductions as we are attempting to do with this legislation through international mechanisms and partnerships. There should be no reason for good U.S. jobs to move overseas and be lost to those countries with no checks on their lax environmental laws. The only other alternative, which some of my colleagues and economists have called for, is a carbon tax. Yet those in favor of carbon tax and not a free market cap and trade system cannot guarantee that a tax will achieve the necessary environmental protection. If a carbon tax is set too low, companies will simply pay the tax without reducing emissions. If a tax is set too high, unnecessary costs will be imposed upon businesses and consumers, especially harming low-income Americans. A flexible but mandatory cap and trade allows market forces to find the lowest cost solutions for the desired level of environmental protection. Additionally, according to the government's own Energy Information Agency, under this legislation, the U.S. gross domestic product will continue to grow. In 2030, the EIA finds that GDP will be just 0.3% lower than a business-as-usual scenario. At the same time, the largest proportion of revenues, hundreds of billions of dollars, that this legislation will generate through the transaction of carbon credits will be designated to develop and deploy technologies to transform existing energy sectors and to create entirely new green industries such as solar, wind, renewable industries, cellulosic biofuels, hybrid plug-in cars, as I mentioned previously, as well as high-paying jobs, and to wean us off carbon dioxide polluting fossil fuels. As we look to the future, Mr. President, we must also be reminded that reducing our carbon emissions means reducing our use of oil. And when we spend more than $500 billion purchasing imported oil, helping to finance the radical ambitions of radical leaders, do we really want to say we're unable to summon the innovative, can-do spirit of which this country was built to break our dependence on fossil fuels and foreign oil? This legislation is a monumental step forward in severing that bond, in advancing our energy security and our national security, and we must not wait a moment longer. Mr. President, I yield the floor.